He's handed it in to the Faculty of Arts in order to obtain the title of PhD. An assessment committee has been set up and in the preliminary assessment, the committee has recommended that the thesis should be defended at a PhD defense. The assessment committee consists of Professor Scott Slovich, English Department, University of Idaho from United States, which you see him on the screen. Welcome to you, Scott Slovich. Associate Professor Etienne-Marie Lassie, Department of French, University of Manitoba, Canada. Welcome to you, Professor. And Associate Professor Marianne Ping Huang from Comparative Literature, Aarhus University. And Marianne Ping Huang has been the chair of the committee. Main supervisor has been Mads Rosendal Thomsen, Comparative Literature, School of Communication and Culture. Co-supervisor has been Associate Professor Peter Mortensen, who will join us a bit later from Department of English, also from Aarhus University. Before we begin, I have some practical remarks. The duration of the PhD defense can be a maximum of 3 hours, including a break of 15 minutes. If anyone among the audience, that goes both for the online audience and for those of you who are here in the room, wish to present an opposition or ask a question, ex auditorio, they must tell me this in the break. Then they'll be given time to do so. But we'll proceed as follows. First, the PhD student Kenneth Nsah will be given 30 minutes to present his project. After that, the first opponent, and that is Scott Slovich, will have 40 minutes to present his opposition, including time for dialogue with Kenneth, and then there'll be a break of 15 minutes. After this, the second opponent, who is Etienne-Marie Lassie, has 40 minutes also to present opposition and dialogue with Kenneth. And after this, if any one of you would like to ask a question, you'll be given time. You spend a maximum of 20 minutes for questions from the audience. Finally, at the end, the chair, Marianne Ping Huang, has 30 minutes for opposition and dialogue with the doctoral student, and she will also give a brief summary of the PhD defense. I have one technical remark. The chat, I'll kindly ask you not to use the chat function. Those of you who have a computer, those of you who are with us online, not to use the chat function while the defense is on. But if you want to ask a question, those of you who are online, you can write it in the chat during the break, and then you will be given time later on. Also, I'd like to tell those of you who are with us online that you can choose between speaker's view and gallery view. I don't know if you're familiar with that function, but you can press it in the right-hand corner. With these words, I will end the welcome and give the word to Kenneth, please.
Thank you, Karen Margrethe. Thank you, Karen Margrethe. To start my talk, I think I need to share my slides so that they can facilitate my presentation. So my PhD, as Karen Margrethe has rightly said, is entitled "Can Literature Save the Congo Basin? Post-Colonial Eco-Criticism and Environmental Literary Activism." First, this is an area view of what the Congo Basin or parts of the Congo Basin can look like. Because my work is place-based, it's literature, of course, comparative literature, but with a very special focus on the Congo Basin, which is a geostrategic and biodiversity hotspot in Central and West Africa. So the Congo Basin is fondly called the second lung of the earth. And this is because it's assumed that it's also taken into consideration that the Amazon is the first lung of the earth. And the Congo Basin is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world after the Amazon, and is found in Central Africa, cutting across 6 countries, including Cameroon, my native country, Central African Republic, Congo Brazzaville, or the Republic of Congo, that is the former French Congo, and then Congo Kinshasa, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in other words, the former Belgian Congo, and Equatorial Guinea. This basin is home to about 1.7, it measures about 1.7 billion square meters. That's about 40 million hectares, and it drains an area approximately the size of Western Europe, and is home to millions of people, about 75 million people from almost 150 ethnic groups, including indigenous people like the Bakas, the Batua, the Babingas, etc., who depend on it for their food, for their fresh water, for their shelter, for their medicine, for their religious or spiritual lives, and many more services. It is also home to thousands of fauna and flora species, including 7,000 species of fish, about 400 species of mammals, about 1,000 species of tropical plants. And of all the species in the Congo Basin, 80% of them are native or indigenous to the basin. And it is very important in terms of mitigating climate change because of its capacity for carbon sequestration. And not long ago, in 2017, peatlands were discovered in the Congo Basin, which can store up to about 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which is the equivalent of 3 years of global emissions. And it's rich, the Congo Basin, of course, is very rich in mineral resources like crude oil, diamond, cobalt, copper, coltan, timber, uranium, and so on and so forth. And of course, this basin is under threat. It's being threatened by industrialization, logging, mining, agriculture, urbanization, demographics, and a host of many other factors. And so I approach this dissertation from a pragmatic and practical approach, looking at how literature can be helpful in efforts by different disciplines, academic disciplines, but of course also political actions and other stakeholders in trying to serve the Congo Basin for its importance for itself first, and also but for its importance for climate change and environmental concerns. So in line with Rob Nixon's concept of environmental writer activists, I therefore consider some of the writers in my dissertation as background informed literary activists, activists whose educational backgrounds in a way shape or influence the way that they write about nature, about environment, about climate change in the Congo Basin. And this, of course, is also situated within a particular tradition, the tradition of African functional aesthetics, and also even the tradition of what is known as theater for development, or community theater, or popular theater, or political theater. As Timothy Clark puts it, the majority of eco-critics, because I'm using eco-criticism as a critical tool in this work, Clark says a majority of eco-critics see their intellectual work as a kind of worthwhile activism committed to the argument that a change in cultural values can lead to less destructive forms of life. So he's talking about a kind of green advocacy where we take into consideration political and social context, being aware that literature has the potential to influence or to shape public debate and representations, because of course it's believed that literature has some power, even no matter how debatable this is in terms of assessing the veracity or how long or how far literature has that power. So it is sometimes argued, says Rob Nixon, that eco-criticism's singular contribution to environmental studies should be at the aesthetic dimension, meaning attentiveness to the form of work, how appealing a piece of work it is. But Rob Nixon, and I agree with him, thinks that there is a risk of severing, of cutting off this theory from the reality if we don't connect it to the environmental problems or the climate change problems that it is aimed at addressing. So my design of work, or the way I approach this work from a methodological perspective, I've brought together a number of methods, including field work, which is not very common in literary studies, and also interviews with authors, and eco-criticism, of course, and then a special strand of eco-criticism known as post-colonial eco-criticism. field work, of course, is not so common in literature, but it's a common thing, for example, in anthropology. But I thought that it was important not to rely only on my Cameroonian perspective of the Congo Basin, but to have another field. And so I went to Congo Brazzaville as part of my research to have a field of issues about the Congo Basin from that country. And I visited the University of Marianne Ngouambi and the École Normale Supérieure in Brazzaville, and then in Yaoundé, the University of Yaoundé 1 and the École Normale Supérieure de Yaoundé. And I also used interviewing of authors. This is not too new in literary studies, but it's not also so common. And I specifically decided to interview only those writers I call background informed writers. And so you can see here, this is Ekwe Inyang, and this is Henri Njombo. And these are writers who have studied something that is related to ecology in one way or the other, and they have worked or they are still working in the sector of either conservation or forestry management or climate change and the related stuff. And so I interviewed the two of them I already mentioned, then, and also Asitu Ndinga here, and Nadia Origo from Gabon. Ekwe Inyang is from Cameroon, Jombo is from Congo Brazzaville, Nadia is from Gabon, and Asitu Ndinga is also from Congo Brazzaville. Like I already mentioned earlier, my main critical framework is eco-critical theory, and it is quite eclectic because it gives room for borrowing methodological and epistemological concepts from a wide range of fields in order to engage with these very multifaceted and complex issues that are climate change and environmental degradation or ecological collapse. So one of the first definitions of this field of study, as propounded by Glotfelty and Fromm, was that, or remains that, literature is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. But of course, this definition has grown. For example, Scott Slovic proposes that it is the study of explicit environmental text. And by text here now we go beyond literary to include, for example, film, to include cinema, visual arts, etc., by way of any scholarly approach, or conversely, the scrutiny of ecological implications and human nature relationships in any literary text or other form of human cultural expression. Even texts that seem at the first glance sometimes to be oblivious of the non-human world. And then post-colonial eco-criticism on its part promotes an attention to indigenous issues of indigeneity, post-coloniality, neo-colonial realities, as well as difference and interconnection. And as Sule Egia says it pushes for recognition of the need for difference and interconnection. And so he thinks that the greatest strength of post-colonial eco-criticism is this kind of dichotomy of looking for or looking towards difference and at the same time looking towards interconnection. And that is exactly or similarly what Jessica Morpho expresses by saying that eco-critics generally agree that the most important challenge in pragmatic, theoretical, imaginary, and cognitive terms is to address both the global and the local at the same time. So I draw on the eclecticism and interdisciplinarity of eco-criticism to examine a selection of literary texts from three genres: play, that is drama, prose, and poetry, written in French and in English. And they are written by 10 authors from the Congo Basin, like Nsah from Cameroon, and Enyang, and Gaston Paul Effa, and Kouanye, and Patrice Ngana, all from Cameroon, and then Etienne Goyemide from the Central African Republic, Asitu and Dinga and Henri Njombo from Congo Brazzaville, and Nkole Yang Bofani from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nadia Origo from Gabon. And I'm looking at their works in terms of how they represent environmental and climate issues, both at the local and the global levels, and how they can or could contribute towards climate action, environmental protection or conservation, sustainability, and of course, environmental justice in the Congo Basin. So this is just a list of some of the plays that I've worked on. I will not read all of them. It's just for us to have an appraisal of that, to see the number of texts, and even there are more to this, sometimes not taken in depth or cited in passing. And then in terms of the relevance or the why I'm doing this work, I think that I'm trying to contribute to counter the predominance of the Amazon Basin in environmental humanities and eco-criticism, because there is a lot of work on the Amazon Basin in this field and almost none from the Congo Basin perspective. And also, of course, going beyond the initial focus, because post-colonial eco-criticism has over-focused in the past years on the Niger Delta, the oil-rich Niger Delta in Nigeria, and the environmental martyr from Nigeria, Ken Saro-Wiwa, and then the late Nobel laureate from Kenya, Wangari Maathai, and the fiction of Jacques Nsah from South Africa. So I am joining other scholars in departing from this initial focus on the Niger Delta and Maathai, Saro-Wiwa in African post-colonial eco-criticism. And also, I hope to be able to decenter the certain kind of hegemony or in terms of genres, because a lot of attention has been paid to novels and poetry when it comes to eco-criticism, but not drama. So, and of course, another issue or another scholarly gap I'm trying to fill with this work is in terms of language. A lot of eco-critical scholarship on the African continent or about the African continent is structured along linguistics lines, often having volumes in English or volumes in French, and so, and with the predominance of the Anglophone sphere, of course. And so I try to bridge this Anglophone-Francophone divide in my African eco-critical scholarship. And I also try to address the relative sparseness of eco-critical engagement in Francophone African literatures. And I must also remark that this is not too peculiar to Africa, because by the sheer volume of eco-critical scholarship, globally speaking, the Francophone sphere is still relatively also lagging behind as compared to the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American sphere. And then, of course, I also try through my work to foreground or to highlight the importance of indigenous knowledge systems, which are often overlooked in eco-criticism, and also by pointing out the other ways of seeing and other ways of co-inhabiting this world with other beings. So some of my key arguments are as follows. I argue that the text under study have the capacity to raise ecological awareness and to engage with and expose ambiguities, complexities, contradictions, tensions, entanglements, and relationalities in the Congo Basin. And I also argue that these texts have lives of their own. And so because they are not only manipulated or unallowed to tell the stories intended by their authors, but they have internal mechanisms that sometimes make them even to deliver unintended messages. And so both their intended and unintended stylistic techniques and aesthetic features work together in a way that challenge assumptions, unveil absences, or problematic presences. I posit that the text under study, they also give voice to the non-human agency, and they highlight human oppression and the capital exploitation of the more than human world or more than human beings in this basin. I also argue that these texts help us to question our human values and belief systems and to foreshadow catastrophic and sustainable futures simultaneously, thus inviting individuals and communities to take action. And I also contend that no one person or discipline or approach can save the Congo Basin or by extension resolve the global climate environmental crisis. And so I suggest that these literatures have their role to play in synergy with other disciplines, with other methodologies, with other approaches in addressing climate change and ecological breakdown in the Congo Basin. So before I come to the end of my presentation, I have some food for thought for every one of us. I wonder if we can effectively resolve the climate and environmental crisis if we don't change our mindsets, our belief systems, vis-a-vis how we relate to the other beings that share this planet with us, whether they are animals or plants or water or the air or the soil, and etc., or the stones and the rocks, etc., etc. And I think that literature is particularly crucial in helping us to question our current exploitative and wasteful attitudes towards nature and the commons, which of course within capitalist discourses are often called resources, and to reformulate and reimagine more entangled and sustainable ways of cohabiting the earth and of course the Congo Basin. And it is therefore in this regard that I submit that literature can contribute its own quota in synergy with other disciplines and efforts in saving the Congo Basin. Ayong thank you. Merci. Tak.
Thank you, Kenneth, also for keeping the time. And I immediately give the word to Professor Scott Slovich. Please.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Great, great. Well, hello, Kenneth, and welcome everyone. Kenneth, that was a very clear and well-organized overview of your project. So thank you very much for that. I wish I could be with you in person today. It looks so festive in the room where many of you are. But the wonders of Zoom enable me to join you from Oregon in the American West, where it's quite early in the morning, actually. We haven't figured out a way to overcome time differences. It's been a great pleasure for me to participate in the examination of Kenneth's doctoral thesis. Oh, and you've heard the title of it several times, but I want to repeat it one more time because the title itself is quite compelling for me as someone who works in the field of eco-criticism. Again, the project is titled, Can Literature Save the Congo Basin? Post-Colonial Eco-Criticism and Environmental Literary Activism. The very title of this project, which echoes that of a well-known book titled, Can Poetry Save the Earth? By a professor from Stanford named John Felstener, who was one of my own mentors when I was an undergraduate. Kenneth's title implies that the project is aware of and in conversation with other important books in the field of eco-criticism. But your project is impressive, Kenneth, in not only its use of existing scholarship, but its original contributions to the field. I speak not only for myself here, but for your entire assessment committee, and I think for your supervisors also. One of the most important aspects of your project to me is its recognition of literature's potential to influence positive social change, as well as its aesthetic and philosophical qualities. I've spent many years trying to keep track of the developments in our field throughout the world, but I'm not a specialist in African literature per se, and certainly not in the multilingual literatures of the Congo Basin. And Kenneth, you mentioned your focus on Anglophone and Francophone literatures, but in reality, other languages are working their way into this literature as well. So it's really not bilingual, but multilingual texts and sensibilities that you're focusing on. So I'd like to say that I find another especially valuable aspect of your project to be the way you've made this literature accessible and engaging for a readership of interested non-specialists, as well as for readers who have a deep background in the authors and texts that you've highlighted in this work. I should say also that I've read many dissertations over the years, but I don't think I've read an article-based dissertation before. And I don't think you highlighted this in your presentation of the project, but rather than a traditional chapter by chapter dissertation, you've actually presented a number of articles that you've either published or currently have completed and submitted for publication, which are independent of each other, and yet they fit very well under the broader rubric that you've created of the rubric of post-colonial eco-criticism and the connections between environmental literature and activism, excuse me, specifically with relation to the Congo Basin. So I think the, sorry, I think the article format works very well, partly because it enables you to present some rather polished studies, more polished than independent chapters written only for the purposes of the dissertation might have been. So I think the article format works well. As you know, Kenneth, because you've read our preliminary assessment, your assessment committee thinks quite highly of your dissertation, but you've also inspired us to contemplate some deeper questions about your project and about the scholarly fields that are relevant to your work. And because of that, I'd like to start the formal defense of your work at this time by engaging in a dialogue with you about some of the facets of your work that particularly caught my eye. And Etienne and Marianne and I have tried to coordinate our focuses so that we're not completely repeating ourselves, but as the first quote unquote opponent, I will raise some topics, and I hope I won't be trampling on the territory of my colleagues in their questioning, but let me get started. The first area that I'd like to discuss with you, Kenneth, is this intersection between literature and activism, or literature as activism. This is perhaps the core of your project, which is the idea that literature in Africa and other regions of the world has the potential to function as social activism, as a way to promote environmental justice and environmental preservation. This ethos, the idea that literature might be a form of activist engagement, is a lively and vitalizing aspect of the field of eco-criticism. It gives eco-criticism traction in the world. It's not just floating in the air or existing in libraries or university campuses, but again, it has a kind of traction, or we hope it has traction. And yet I always find myself wondering if this is wishful thinking rather than a view of literature's effectiveness that can be borne out through case studies. In fact, in your presentation today, Kenneth, you refer to the belief that literature has some power. So we believe it has power. You also mentioned at the very end of your talk the idea that literature has the capacity to raise ecological awareness. It seems to have that capacity, but what's the evidence? So I wonder whether it would be possible for you to refer to some specific examples among the works explored in your study. And you explored many different works in different genres, so you have a lot to choose from. But can you actually tell us some cases where the activist texts have led to concrete social change, or at least to rising consciousness that has a real possibility of improving the societies to which the text's readers and authors belong? And if there is no clear evidence that this has happened yet, I would also like you to think about whether there's the potential for using the new eco-critical methodology that we call empirical eco-criticism, which I hope you're aware of, where you do use social science methods to do experiments with readers or possibly with audiences of plays to see whether their ideas and their actions change at all after exposure to the text or to a performance. So if first, perhaps you could consider whether there are some good examples of actual changes in consciousness or behavior or policies, public policies, as a result of your material. And otherwise, what might be the possibility of using an empirical approach to studying the effect of this literature in the region of the world that you're concerned with? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. Yes, the conviction held by some literary scholars that literature has the potential to influence things in the world is, of course, always debatable within our field of studies, and even more so within eco-criticism. And as you've asked what the evidence is, and you've also already mentioned empirical eco-criticism. Before I come to this, I would like to mention a few points, which of course are not proven, but I can guess, or I can suppose that they might have had. And then first, if we take the drama text by Henri Njombo and Osé Kouagne, known as Le Cri de la Forêt, it was staged, for example, at the sidelines of COP21 in Paris. And this text has also been staged in a number of African countries, including Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Brazzaville, Senegal, and so on and so forth. While, of course, it's difficult or challenging to look at or to come up with a concrete influence on the ground, there are some aspects of this staging or performances that I think can give us clues to their possible impact. And also, even if we take the plays by Ekpe Inyang, especially his commissioned plays like Watana Life, and the plays like The Last Hope. The Watana Life, for example, was staged on World Water Day in Douala. And so it can always be hoped that it touched the audience and something changed, but we can only verify this, of course, through some kind of empirical studies. But if I come back to the case of Njombo, the engagement, because it's very difficult to talk about impact with this text, especially because when it comes to the staging of the plays, there are no reviews. So there are no reviews of the stage performances, and neither do we even have, for example, recordings of the performances. And that is why in my work, as much as possible, I do not engage with their reception or their performances in detail, because there is lack of sufficient material to do that. But then, that being said, the way that the audience reacted to the play, because when Le Cri de la Forêt was staged in Paris, there is a footage of that ceremony, but mostly just a short clip about what happened in the hall, and then now people who are reacting to the text, and the people are quite satisfied with the performance of the play, and these are people who are not even Africans. I think in that excerpt there are about 2 or 3 French men who comment on the play, and even one of them even says that this is a play with a universal appeal, and he thinks that it should be staged all over the world. And so, being people who were, of course, participating in the conference, although we know that they were the people who are interviewed were not like key-level politicians or key-level businessmen involved in that conference, but I can only assume that perhaps these people trickled down their satisfaction and reaction to this play within the halls in Paris, and that in one way or the other, it might have had some effect. Okay, now, and another case is if we take the same play, when it is staged in Cameroon or Congo and other places, sometimes there are photo evidence of it put up by by Kouagne, for example, because Kouagne doubles as a playwright and also a stage director. And I've seen cases where they've staged the play in a school, and thereafter they lead children in that school to plant trees with them at the end of the performance. So these, I think, are some of the few instances that already give us some idea of the possible impact of this plays or this literature on the ground. And then in a very quite distant case, I should say, is that, okay, if we take the novel Les Marchands du Développement Durable by Asitu Ndinga, the way it deals with the questions of autochthony or the question of indigenous people, in the Congo Basin, people who have been forced out of their ancestral forests, and they are being there is an attempt to integrate them into a new liberal capitalist system in the name of conservation. And we look at the fact that the Congo Brazzaville is one of the foremost countries in that basin in terms of being proactive and taking up the climate and environmental agenda. For instance, last year, two significant things happened, and one can guess that maybe the novel, just maybe, that the novel had some effect on that. And those two things are that the appellation for the Ministry of Justice in that country changed from the Ministry of Justice to the Ministry of Justice, Human Rights, and Indigenous People. And also even the Ministry of Environment also changed to the Ministry of Environment and the Congo Basin. And also there are also many countries that are beginning to adopt laws to protect the rights of indigenous people. So we can only gauge and guess that there is some implied influence here. But of course, empirical studies on this, maybe getting to the politicians or getting to students who have watched the play or politicians who have read these novels and then sampling them using empirical methods to know if they changed anything, if they were able maybe even just to sweep a gutter in the quarter after reading those texts would be, I think, much more useful in the future. And the last, on this point, I also think that the literature in question, for me, is important in addressing ecological concerns, not in and of itself alone. I think this is a joint effort between the writers on the one hand and critics on the other hand. And it is therefore in this respect that I think that this work that I have done is also a contribution to making the work or to spreading and disseminating this literature in ways that can be more accessible, and perhaps we can also in the future, if we are carrying out, if I'm carrying out or someone else is carrying out empirical studies on this, be able also to see or to gauge to what extent the criticism of such literature can also help it in its goal of environmentalism.
Thank you so much. That was such a thorough and interesting response to that comment and question. It's obvious to me that you have a lot of ideas about this subject and maybe questions, excuse me. You seem to, and you have your own questions about the effectiveness of this literature. I would love to see you do further studies along these lines, future articles or even book projects, and perhaps even find a way to record some of these performances and perhaps conduct interviews or focus group conversations with people who've been exposed to this cultural material. In addition to collecting quantitative data, empirical approaches would include talking with people who've been exposed to this work and you know, along the lines of the interviews you've already done, but not just with the creators, the writers, but with the audience members or politicians who've been exposed to the material and so forth. So I think this could be a really fruitful way of extending your project. So thank you. Staying with the subject of literature or art more generally and activism, I'm so interested in this concept that you discussed in your presentation today of African functional aesthetics. That word functional is a really interesting word. What is the function of beauty, of works of art? Another common criticism of activist literature is that it sometimes compromises beauty or compromises stylistic innovation in pursuit of communicating social messages. That communicating social messages is the functional part. And sometimes the function outweighs the beauty, outweighs the artfulness. And this is a concern that people sometimes have as soon as you start talking about activism and art. In reading your manuscript, sometimes it seems to me that you're not always necessarily focusing on literature as art, because you're interested in the impact, as you put it, the impact of this literature. So I wonder if the texts you've chosen to write about might sometimes lean toward science communication with sharing ecological ideas, or, I hesitate to say this, but maybe even environmental propaganda, pushing a message.
Yeah.
And whether this could at times undermine the artistic quality of the work. I'm not saying that this is the case, but I'd like to hear how you might respond to readers of your study, of your project, who are nervous about the idea of an activist-focused approach to literary text. How would you reassure them that there is artistic merit in this work, as well as the potential for communicating powerful and important messages?
Yes, absolutely. I do agree with you that in some instances, as far as this literature is concerned, the works, particularly of the writers I've labeled as background-informed environmental literary activists, can gesture in the direction of science communication, or may even be interpreted to be some form of science communication. Because I even argue that by the virtue of the fact that these writers have backgrounds in what one would call maybe pure sciences or ecological sciences, and they are writing in literature, for me, is some kind of admitting the limitations of science in addressing the ecological climate crisis. And so by doing so, there is a possibility that these writers mediate scientific knowledge alongside other forms of knowledge, whether they are indigenous knowledge and, of course, their personal inspiration to communicate. Because raising awareness is, without any doubt, an aspect of communication. And so it goes in that direction of science communication. And of rarely, because this is something that comes up quite often within eco-critical scholarship, the idea that some scholars think that once a work of art is so explicitly, so overtly pursuing a goal, it might lose its aesthetic qualities. And I think that in few cases, you can say that this happens, but even when this happens in some of the texts under study, I read alongside Sule, Emmanuel Egia, these kinds of works as being a kind of manifestation of the urgency within which the writers are operating. So that even when a text at a point seems not to be very much appealing or to very much care about its aesthetic dynamics, it is not to be read in the case of these writers as a weakness, but perhaps as an expression or even a symptom or a metaphor of the fact that these writers are writing within the confines or the context of an emergency, because the climate crisis today, many even call for the fact that we should describe it as a climate emergency. So that's one thing I can say. And of course, I should also add that when I look, for example, at the works of a brilliant writer like Ekpe Inyang, there is a very interesting distinction or difference between his texts that are not commissioned and his texts that are commissioned. So I feel that from my point of view as a critic of these works, that some of his works that are not commissioned sometimes are far more aesthetically deep than are those that are commissioned. And of course, I think these tensions are easy to understand, because writing a commissioned work also means that you are working within the confines of time set by the commissioner, and you need to deliver on certain deadlines, as opposed to when you are writing your own text and you can take as long as you want to write the text, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. That's the idea the ideas you've just mentioned, such as the notion that the scientists among your writers, among your authors, who've made the decision to move in the direction of producing literature, they are thinking of themselves as working in a new medium because they recognize its potential to strike a chord in readers beyond what they can do in their technical fields. So they are, I think that's a good argument that they are attempting to do something with aesthetic resonance because they recognize the unique quality of artistic expression. I should say also regarding the aesthetics of urgency, which is such a nice phrase, that idea, it also loops back to someone like John Felstener in Can Poetry Save the Earth, the book I mentioned earlier. Felstener was very, I should say, keenly interested in urgency and emergency. And I had a number of conversations with Felstener before his death, as he was writing his book, about the relationship between the words urgency and emergency. He was wondering, he wanted to make the sense of desperate importance clear in his study. And he wasn't sure that urgency was forceful enough. He wanted to say poetry engages with the emergency of environmental crisis. And I think that the writers that you're working with are similarly interested in this, I would say, all hands on deck. You know, the ship is going to sink unless we respond to this crisis. And I'm fascinated too with the way you concluded that response, talking about the subtle differences between commissioned and non-commissioned work. And I would love to see you do more on that. And actually, I mean, the whole notion of commissioned art for specific social purposes or political or even science communication purposes, it's a subgenre of environmental writing that probably would justify further study to reveal its existence and importance and contrast it with non-commissioned work. So I'd also, I think I still have time, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about African literature specifically. And so another key aspect of your work, Kenneth, is not only how you've emphasized African literature, but also to some degree African scholarly approaches in addition to international scholarship. And this is something I'm often looking for as I'm reading international examples from around the world of eco-critical studies, to see whether they're using theoretical ideas and language from the parts of the world that are being represented. So in addition to making a lot of use of well-known ideas by someone like Rob Nixon, you're referring to more intrinsically African concepts, such as the one you just mentioned, by Egya, aesthetics of urgency, or the notion of eco-Ubuntu. I wonder if you could talk about the significance of employing both African and non-African scholarly concepts in your project. In particular, I'd like to know if this approach, which I've seen throughout your manuscript, your dissertation, whether it might be related to what you say in chapter 7, where you critique the colonial aspects of a particular type of conservation philosophy, which you call fortress conservation. And you say that the solutions to the cultural and ecological problems that result from fortress conservation should not be imported from outside, but should emanate from Africans, drawing on local expertise, indigenous and other knowledge systems, end quote. Would you say that the emphasis in your project on local expertise in the conservation realm also applies to some extent to the eco-critical scholarship, the idea of eco-critical scholarship? or would you argue that a more hybrid approach, both local and cosmopolitan, is of particular value for a scholarly project like yours?
Thank you. For me, the main argument I make, especially in chapter 7, which you mentioned to end your question, is that fortress conservation is problematic. And because it is, it will be important that efforts in the direction of biodiversity conservation, environmental protection, and climate action and sustainable development or sustainability in the Congo Basin would benefit a lot if they were not imposed, or if they didn't appear as being imposed from outside. Perhaps not imported, because if I go the route of import, I can think that, well, we can borrow. And that's why one little addition that I use at least twice in that chapter is that indigenous knowledge systems, local and indigenous knowledge systems need to be recognized, taken into, integrated, but in synergy with other kinds or other forms of epistemologies. And this, of course, keys into the idea that you raised, the idea of hybridity. So I think that my work, both from the theoretical perspective in terms of what you described as my use of scholarly criticism or eco-critical notions and concepts as formulated by international scholars, but also scholars from within Africa or about Africa or with African origins. I think that that is that kind of the hybridity, because and it goes beyond even just the hybridity. Of course, we all acknowledge and agree that hybridity or difference or multiplicity is beautiful. But I think that that is also, in a sense, speaking to this idea that I mentioned earlier in my presentation today, that post-colonial eco-criticism strongly advocates that we address the global and the local at the same time. And I think that to address global and local concerns, it is important to put in dialogue scholars that represent these kinds of spheres. That is the African domestic sphere and then the extra-African sphere, or we might call it international. And so, yes, I think that it is important to argue for this sense of hybridity, not only in the theory of addressing both local and global concerns, but also even in the practice of how conservation or how mitigation or how adaptation work is being carried out, so that we can, within the eclecticism of eco-criticism, borrow from different sources of epistemologies, of cosmologies, of knowings, of beings, of models, and also, of course, not overlook or undermine, especially indigenous ones, because this has been the case for a long time, especially starting with colonization. And we are talking post-colonial eco-criticism, and as critics like Vandana Shiva say it, and others, colonization is not a thing of the past. It is also a thing of the present, manifesting in different forms, including the kinds of issues that I raise here, such as green imperialism. And so it will be important to merge and to use what Ikea calls looking at valuable aspects of all of these things put together, because of course there can always be some tensions and also possibilities of, maybe it's not like I do not in any way try to glorify or to idealize indigenous knowledges or practices, because of course sometimes you can find practices within these societies that are not very much environmentally friendly, and those ones can be perhaps not used or discarded in favor of those that are much more environmentally friendly, and of course always in combination of knowledge and information from other sources.
Thank you. Thank you. I would say that your project does a very good job of putting both indigenous or local and international concepts and language in dialogue with each other. And I think one of the results of that, I would hope, would be that a work like yours would help to stimulate some interest, increasing interest in the environmental aspect of literary and cultural studies. among colleagues in Africa. And and this is still under the subject of African literature or African literary studies. I wonder how you imagine scholars of African literature, including those based in Africa, whose work might not typically fall into the category of eco-criticism or environmental humanities, how they might benefit from reading the articles that comprise your dissertation. In other words, what do you hope your research might contribute to the larger field of African literary studies?
It is my hope that first, this work serves as some kind of inspiration for those scholars and even writers that are not often studied within international circles. And also by blending the concepts, the theoretical concepts that they formulate on the continent, especially people who struggle to publish, and sometimes they don't publish in the places that are considered in the global north as being maybe journals of high repute or presses of high repute, that if their work can find its way in dialogue or get into dialogue with the work of other international scholars, I think there is a lot of benefits that can fall in all the directions. So for me, I would like to consider my own work more or less. I don't want to make big claims about the work or its contribution, but I would rather want to think that this should be an inspiration and also the beginning of more bridge building, a bridge building between scholars on the continent and scholars outside the continent, especially those who theorize and analyze and interpret works that deal with the African continent in question.
Kenneth, I think that's a very realistic goal, and I really do believe that the articles that you've been writing for this project are contributing in that way. And I would say one important aspect of the bridge building of the sense of mutual dialogue is to contribute original ideas. And if I have time for one more question before we take a break, I would like to ask a little bit about your own original contributions to the field by way of this thesis. For instance, I was interested in the way you not only embrace Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence, which has been so influential in the field of eco-criticism during the past decade, but you build on this idea and introduce your own notion of simultaneous violence. I wonder if you could expand a bit on your idea about how simultaneous violence intersects with the idea of slow violence. What I mean is, you're not replacing Nixon's idea and saying there is no slow violence, he was incorrect. We should be thinking instead of something called simultaneous violence. But I wonder, for instance, for me, a key aspect of Nixon's concept of slow violence is the idea that we struggle to apprehend, that's Nixon's word, to struggle to apprehend or perceive various instances of systemic cultural violence or gradual, non-spectacular ecological violence. Would you say that simultaneous violence, which is your term, is similarly difficult to perceive because of the simultaneous layering of climate change, species depopulation or even extinction, governmental corruption, poverty, etc., the various human and non-human conditions that are layered together in murky, complicated ways? I think your concept of simultaneous violence complements Nixon's concept in valuable ways. And I'd like to give you a chance to reflect on this and perhaps extend what I just said about the interconnections, the dialogue, let's say, between your notion of simultaneous violence and Nixon's idea of slow violence.
Yes, thank you. My main point is, as you already observed, not to replace Nixon's slow violence, but to complement it and to point out to other forms of violence that are associated with it. Because slow violence, as Nixon defines it, is mostly defined in opposition to what might be called instantaneous violence, the violence that is so sensational that it attracts immediate media attention. Whereas slow violence is that one that is quite gradual and usually almost imperceptible or invisible and insidious, and then dispersed across time, dispersed across space. And of course, are not usually a point of interest for journalists or media men and women. And so I think that by proposing the idea of slow violence, I want to point out the fact that there's some instances of environmental or ecological violence that are multi-layered in ways that include both slow violence and also instantaneous violence. And so to illustrate this point, I use, for example, the idea of the use of gamalin, which is a poison in the play Watana Life to kill fish. And my discussion is that, well, this poison can sometimes kill the fish, because violence, of course, should not only or must not only be perceived from the angle of humans, because that's another very crucial thing in post-colonial eco-criticism or eco-criticism as a whole, that it is important as much as possible to decenter anthropocentrism. And so, and look at violence and not only being something that is affecting the poor, as in Nixon's slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor, but also to look at how violence even affects more than human beings. And so within this perspective, my argument is that if we take that poison and the fact that it can kill instantly, and then we associate it to the other pollutants in the water, which can gradually cause diseases like cholera and kill people, then we find that there are some kind of manifestations of an instantaneous violence, as in the case of one or a fish or someone eating the poison and dropping that on the spot, and then someone who develops cholera and gradually, eventually dies in a hospital. And by extension, I also take that to include instances of like floods and landslides in particular. And landslides have been invoked in the plays Le Mal de Terre by Henri Njombo, for instance, and in the novel Le Voyage d'Oro by Nadia Origo. And my argument here is that at the time that a landslide occurs, it is a sensational, instantaneous violence, attention grabbing. But usually the environmental factors that have accumulated up to that point have been slow and having even some forms of or creating victims and affecting humans and non-humans in ways that have not grabbed the attention of the media that might come just during the landslides. And so that is why I propose this concept, so that we can be able to look at multiple and intersecting layers of violence. And of course, at each time that I mention simultaneous violence, it means that within that violence, there is slow violence and instantaneous and other forms of violence.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I like your idea of simultaneous violence quite a bit, and would like to encourage you to continue to use that term in other projects and help that idea to gain currency within the larger field. And also, I think one of the aspects of your dissertation that most impressed me was that you weren't merely recycling a lot of pre-existing concepts and terminology. It's common for doctoral students to demonstrate their knowledge by using words and ideas that are already in existence, thanks to other scholars. It's less common to introduce original ideas and to have the confidence to promote new vocabulary and theories. And I see this happening in your project, perhaps because these are published or potentially publishable articles. So you're really pushing for that originality that would make a genuine contribution to the field. So I would congratulate you on that and also encourage you to continue to do that. And one of the results of introducing some of this compelling and useful terminology is that it will increase the potential for strong dialogue between different scholars from different parts of the world. So I see your thesis as making a strong start in that direction. So I could continue talking with you for a long time. I have a long list of questions, but I'm a little bit worried that my other questions might overlap with the areas that Etienne and Marianne wanted to discuss with you. And I don't want to steal any more of their thunder by pushing into their terrain. So I hope it's not too early to suggest that perhaps we can take a pause before turning to the other members of your assessment committee. Karen, Margaret, would that be okay?
I think you have spent 40 minutes. Kenneth didn't quite use his time, but it's
okay.
It is okay. Yeah.
Okay.
If you have one last burning question, you're also welcome to pose it.
No. I've asked plenty of questions, I think,
Okay.
and we've heard very good responses from Kenneth. So thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Scott Slovich and Kenneth for this first half. We'll have 15 minutes break and we'll be back at 2:36. And I hope there's coffee out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Very interesting. Yeah. I think you're doing good. Tell people about it. Yeah, it's very
Let me just read and wait for the rest. Yeah.
Some allow much courage.
My man.
I hope I can say something. I mean, I hope I can. I'm allowed to. I'm speaking with some fear because I'm not sure whether.
No, I think that a breakdown.
Okay, bro. No, Masa. I mean, you are just excelling and excelling and excelling. I can only say, and then sell more. Continue, as Provia says.
Bro, thank you for the courage. Thank you.
Yeah. So as the people the record, I'm so no need for you for do as we talk now.
Yeah, but if you do and you do, but no way, no problem. Because yeah,
Yeah,
you go
actually,
on.
yeah, okay, yeah. As I the record, I say, okay, then no need no see over there because I mean it could
Yeah,
obviously be of a better quality too.
yeah. But
This
no,
is
no
direct.
discontinue.
Yes, exactly. Well, Master Courage. I
Hello,
know
Ken.
I don't want to
Thank you,
talk.
bro. Lambi?
Courage. We there together.
Okay.
Yes.
Now
My
Lambi.
name's
Eh,
Ken Uyuma.
You are at the you and can never ensure James. Gorani, Ken, Betty, Thomas. Wow. Wow. Thank you guys for watching.
Yeah, it started
Okay.
Hello, bro.
You is yeah. I think you.
Kono
Atu
juga
no.
tu.
Ai cái đó chứ.
Ya, wajiben kono ada beng no.
Ayo ke dah. Begini gitu
Maje
ber
ke,
ayo ke.
yana maje ke ngalek se rekole. Yiti ilang mana seleng man rekota neng lomsom half this singa messenger mak ngalek se rekol. Yiti kono ma phone ma press induvi.
Ah, where
So
one me
ma look
aka.
at some screenshots and some, you know. I just took some screenshots.
Okay.
Wait, you
Okay.
telling te kum no basa abas ke say. Yeah, wana kono kind. Why na we?
Ayo. Ayo ke.
Hey.
So whatever is event ate.
And then Nini.
Ungana brother Lambe kalau nung connect is it yang kena ne wak weng kene ba do off.
Where? I'm a kiwi.
Okay. Mention a do off ne. Earlier
Well,
now
I'm maybe.
to connect. Earlier now from Cameroon to the connect.
Aku tengok kita yang berlaki kita lagi lihat dengar lakukan.
Yeah, and yeah, we see.
I'm so proud of you, bro. That's great. Keep fighting.
Okay.
Samara, bro.
Thank you, bro. Thank you. Just one small reminder to the audience online. I think they say we don't have to write in the chat box until if we have a question to ask, or maybe until at the end of it, I think.
All right. Oh, that's nice. So you look into how long later, how many hours or how many minutes?
It ends at about 4:15. So we still have we have done half of the defense already. Almost
okay,
half.
What time is it?
We have two members of the jury who are still going to ask me their own questions. So time for us now is 2:30. So we still have up to 3 and then 4 at 4:15. I think it will end at 4:15 because I think I think
that's so. 2 hours from now.
Yeah, I'm just guessing because
two people want to ask questions. Excellent. Are you prepared?
Physically, yeah.
One of them is Peter Barker. You know
Okay.
Peter
Yeah,
Barker?
not Peter Bear.
And the other one, I just get the name. I'm not sure about who he is.
All right. Calimagrete, is it at 36?
36.
Okay.
Hello, you're very brave.
Nasun.
Sorry.
You want go defend? Why not we make a visa quick? Where? Let me try to forward you the link on Messenger. It's not the C4. Why link at him? I think the links one. Manisho nas very soon. So let me like mute my mic.
I still need to send you all of those pictures of winter. If I can show it to
Kirsten, er der nogen på chatten, der har bedt om at stille spørgsmål? Okay. Kirsten, har vi Etienne Marie kendt?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. We'll start in just a second. We're just getting the audience in. Okay, I think we are ready to start again. Two people have asked to ask a question, and they will be given time to do so after the second opponent. But first, I give the word to Etienne Marie. Here you go.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the defense of Kenneth dissertation. I will not repeat the well-deserved word of praises that Scott has said on Kenneth's work. That is very impressive. And I will just go on with the discussion of the thesis. I will start with chapter 3 that deals with the deforestation in Le Cri de la Forêt, a play written by Henri Jumbo and Coagnon, I think. You demonstrate how scientific background informed literary texts may produce literary environmental activism. The play is analyzed as being structured around a binary opposition, the local population destroying the forest out of ignorance on one side, and le fonctionnaire and essence of the village, on the other hand, who are trained scientists trying to educate the villagers on how to preserve the environment. In the end, a natural disaster in the form of a drought forces the villagers out of their homeland, and this indicates the point of view of the scientists has prevailed. There are questions I would like to ask about that. The first one is, the binary opposition in the play can also be interpreted as an opposition between the centralized government and the grassroots communities. le fonctionnaire being a government agent. One of the co-authors of the play, Henry Jumbo, was a cabinet minister in Congo, and in encouraging artisanal use of the forest for firewood, discouraging rather, while advocating for the more destructive industrial exploitation of the forest. That, to me, is consistent with the government decisions in some Congo Basin countries. So the question is, do you think that besides the scientific background of the authors, attention should also be given to their political background? How does the political background of an author can inform his literary work? And, or would you have arrived at a different conclusion if you had considered the political status rather than the scientific training of the author? And to extrapolate for this question, and from the fact that the Congo Basin is blessed, and the word is in quote, with some of the world's longest serving presidents, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Congo, while changes in Central African Republic is a result of multiple military coups. So from those, do you think there is any clear connection between a democratic governance that take local communities' point of view into account and environmental activism? Can the absence of democracy explain why youth activism in the Congo Basin is more present in literature in the form of things people hope for than in reality, as it is implied in your chapter 4 on youth climate activism? So maybe we should discuss that before I move on to another question.
Thank you, Etienne. I think there are actually two questions from you. The one about the political backgrounds of the authors, and then the one about the absence of democracy. So starting with the one about the background, I use background in the expression background informed environmental literary activism. Actually, yes, of course, I know I've mentioned educational backgrounds quite a lot or quite a bit, but backgrounds that is actually quite encompassing, and it encompasses educational backgrounds, but also professional backgrounds. And I think being a politician in a sense is part of the professional background. And from this angle, I agree with you that the political position of someone, especially the case of the writer Henry Njombo here, who has been a minister for many years and in different capacity, including the Ministry of Environment and Forestry Management, can have some kind of tenuous or conflicting influence in their activism that is important to point out. Perhaps I've not pointed that out in the work very emphatically, but I've tried to indicate that there is a tendency for that play to align with governmental policy or the governmental point of view, and thereby pitting these communities or the community on the one hand versus the government in a way that I find it not to be quite participatory, as for example, propagated or propounded within the discourses and practices of forestry management, such as community-based management. Because le fonctionnaire, for example, who is representing the government, is a forestry agent who comes just to tell the people about a law that has been adopted in the parliament, telling them what to do and what not to do in their forest. And I think that if that law was rather emanated from a kind of a consensual discussion between the government and then the people of that community, there might have been less or little resistance from the point of view of the people. So yes, the political background has a lot to play, and of course, just like even the backgrounds, professional backgrounds, because when you are writing about, for example, issues of conservation, and you work within the conservation sector, there will obviously, without any doubt, be tensions, be some kinds of hesitations that can sometimes influence the kinds of positionalities adopted by a writer. That can even amount to, I want to borrow one of the remarks in the preliminary assessment, can amount to, yes, of course, a kind of green imperialism. And I would like to maybe call that one a kind of internal green imperialism as opposed to external green imperialism. And then on the question of the absence of democracy, yes, I will connect this because you've mentioned chapter 4 about youth activism, and you asked if the absence of democracy is part of the explanation for the timid mobilization of young people on the African continent for the climate cause. And I agree absolutely that that is part of it. And I try to explain this in the thesis by using the argument about political repression. Regarding political repression, I've cited 2 examples. The example, for example, of a political party in Cameroon known as Le Mouvement pour la Renaissance du Cameroun of Professor Maurice Kamto, whose militants were doing a kind of cleanup campaign, which can, of course, be dubbed as an environmental campaign sometime in a market in Yaoundé, and they were arrested. And then, of course, I also mentioned the case of even climate activists in a place like Ghana, which, of course, according to different African connotations and interpretations of democracy, is quite democratic to compare, for example, with Cameroon. But even so, even in the Ghana, we've seen climate activists who are complaining about fear and the fear to demonstrate because perhaps they might be arrested. And I also even, for example, extend it to the case of the Extinction Rebellion in the UK. I think it was in 2019 when the Extinction Rebellion people were demonstrating and blocking roads in the UK, and they were also brutally handled by the police. And I think these are things that can send wrong signals and even frighten or impede potential climate activists from going down the road to act. And so to connect it now to chapter 6 about the eco-politics of water pollution and disorderly urbanization, I think that there is some degree of there is an extent to which we can argue that when there is good governance, environmental governance is also significantly improved and vice versa. And for this reason, absence of government or absented presence of government, or the presence of government in a wrong way, like when government is present through overwhelming corruption, as it is the case, for example, in that play, Le Mal de Terre, where there is rampant corruption in both low and high places that leads to deforestation and haphazard urban expansion. I think it becomes clear there that there is a correspondence between the level of governance and also environmental governance or sustainability in the Congo Basin, of course, as well as some elsewhere.
Okay, thank you very much, Kenneth, for that thorough answer that give us the opportunity to see how connected your chapters are, even though they are written as separate and autonomous articles. And the next point would be, again, starting from that opposition I found in the play. The opposition between the local and the government can also be seen to be pitting indigenous knowledge, local practices and artisanal exploitation against foreign knowledge, as those people are trained abroad, and the capitalist exploitation of the environment. So how do you reconcile the success of the Western trained scientists and the humiliation of the village chief with the epistemicide that you decry while pleading for the valorization of African knowledge and know-how in chapter 7? And the plot in Le Cri de la Forêt, as you describe it, is very similar to the pattern of what Guillaume Blanc, that you quote in chapter 7, calls green colonialism. It consists in the use of science to disqualify the environmental knowledge and practices of a third world community, lay blame of environmental depletion on them, and then evict them from their homeland in order to save the environment. You mentioned it while answering the other question. Is it possible that Le Cri de la Forêt constitutes a form of green colonialism? You touched on that while answering the question. And following up from this, well, you might want to answer those before we move on.
Yeah. Yes, I think that the tension between those two communities can be read in a sense along the lines that you just evoked there, as being some kind of triumph of Western science, because the people or the characters in the play who stand for Western science are le fonctionnaire, who has received, in quotes, Western education, and also Chief Kamona's nephew, Toboli, who would later on, who would study and obtain a PhD in ecology and return to a drought-devastated Mbala community. But I am not very sure if I can take it only to be that the triumph of Western science. I think that even in the indigenous cosmology and worldview of the people of Mbala, there seems to be something wrong or something not going the right way. First, before I do this, I want to quote Kajetan Ikea, who says, for example, that there is a potential value in indigenous knowledges for even thinking about planetarity or the planetary dimension of the environmental crisis. And that even in doing so, we have to be aware of the valuable aspects and also pay attention to their blind spots. And now, if I bring this back to that play, the first thing that will strike me or strike most readers is that by the end or towards the end of the play, when the drought strikes, we see Chief Kamona pouring libations, but we haven't seen him pour those libations at the beginning. And so there is a possibility that one could ask if he could, before embarking on the, and of course, I should really mention this caveat, and I do agree with you, as I've explained quite at length in that chapter, that it is not true that domestic harvesting of wood for local consumption is not the highest factor that is driving deforestation in the Congo Basin. It is instead commercial exploitation, mainly destined for exportation. But we find this situation that generally local people are blamed for just getting the wood that they use to cook their food. But that being said, this does not refute the fact that even that local consumption in its way contributes its own bit to deforestation. And if we take it that way, that it contributes to deforestation, one could wonder if Chief Kamona, being the custodian of the customs and the traditions of his community, who pours libation when the drought are stricken, could have possibly consulted the gods earlier enough to ask them how far he can go into the forest or how much of the wood he can harvest. And I think that from this perspective, then it becomes possible to argue that the play is not only a celebration of Western science, but perhaps also a pointer to what can happen if we only turn to our spirituality when the damage has been done. I'm not sure if I've answered the other question. Were there two questions, Etienne, please?
I mentioned the green colonialism.
Okay. We try to refresh.
the pattern of evicting people from their homeland. And maybe I can explain more what I mean. Because in your whole dissertation, there seem to be two conflicting conceptions of the environment. On one hand, that of indigenous communities who view nature as what provides shelter and living means and is fundamental for the cultural and spiritual life. And on the other hand, that of the scientists or the political institutions that perceive nature as something to be set aside and protected from the said local communities. And given the balance of power that is always in favor of those, the scientists and the political, is there any future for the African knowledge and practices, some of which originate from pre-colonial era and that shape people relations with their environment? How do you reconcile environmental activism that dwells on the preservation of the nature and the people's ecological rights to access and use their environment, just like in that play, Le Cri de la Forêt, or in the other play about the water and the urbanization? And the question about the green colonialism was the pattern described in Guillaume Blanc's text is science is used to evict people from their home, blaming them for destroying the environment. So that's the question. Is it understood now?
And yes, in Le Cri de la Forêt, for example, and also in The Last Hope by Ekpe Inyang, there are these issues raised about green colonialism, especially in terms of expelling indigenous and local communities from their ancestral forest in the name of conservation, which is quite problematic, especially if we trace its colonial history. If we trace the colonial history of this concept known as fortress conservation, by which we mean evicting people and then maybe erecting fences or militarizing zones and prohibiting them from getting access to those places where they had previously lived and harvested from nature for their basic needs. And yes, I agree with you that this already connects even with the whole idea of the conflicting views of nature, because for the indigenous and local communities, it's usually about harvesting from their natural environments for their daily survival. Whereas the kinds of ideas, the kinds of ideologies that underpin conservation, for the most part, I don't want to claim that it's in every conservation effort in this basin, but for the most part, it's usually that, well, keep the forest and they will render you services, you will make money out of the forest. And even for people who do not have a worldview centered around making money, for example, the indigenous Bakal or the indigenous Babinga and other people who are known as pygmies in quotes, because the word pygmy is quite contested and derogatory in some instances. So yes, the way that these people have a different view, for them, especially if you look in the novel by the Central African Republican writer Etienne Goyemide, in the novel, the indigenous people have their own way of life, which has got nothing. And even in addition, Asitu Ndinga's novel also demonstrates quite clearly that indigenous people do not have this worldview of buying and selling, this worldview of amassing wealth and being rich and making money, but they basically harvest what they need and they share among themselves in a spirit of solidarity. And their main goal is pursuing their happiness and pursuing their existence in conjunction with the existence of the other beings on which they depend. But now it becomes quite problematic. And that is why I am thinking that there is a serious need for reconsidering the objectives of conservation. so that nature in being conserved, whether it is biodiversity in terms of wildlife or species of trees, must not continuously be protected, or the campaigns around the protection must not continue to be premised on the idea that it will provide wealth, or on the idea, in fact, it actually promotes some kind of commodification of nature, and which opens nature up for very conflicting ideas that come with neoliberal globalization and capitalism. Now we are faced with questions of ownership: who owns the land, or who owns the wood, or who owns the animal? But one can even ask, can the animal not own itself? Can the wood not own itself? Can the forest not own itself just for itself? I'm sorry I've ended with a question, but it's a rhetorical one.
Thank you. But do you see any future for those indigenous knowledge? And what about the people's environmental right? How do we reconcile environmental activism and human rights?
Yes, I think there is a future for indigenous knowledges if and only if scholars and other stakeholders rise up to the task of excavating them, of promoting them, but at the same time being aware of not appropriating them in ways that can amount to what Shiva calls piracy, for example, so that it doesn't come across as being maybe the theft of their knowledge. But so what I'm trying to say is this: if we, for example, as scholars, as work on these knowledge systems, we must continuously and consistently be sure that we acknowledge the people who own the knowledge, and that we are clear and transparent as to the intended uses and the fallout. Who owns that knowledge, and what are the benefits, and who, because we are dealing with a global economic system that puts a lot of emphasis on ownership, proprietary ownership. And so there is the fear, of course, that scientists, scholars, and other stakeholders can grab this knowledge, not only can, often sometimes grab this knowledge and then they pass it for theirs, or they use it without acknowledging the communities, or without even making sure that the communities receive the benefits that come from there. So that's it in terms of thinking that there is a future. I think there is a future, but the future is only if there is more work to be done in terms of promoting these knowledge systems, especially with respect for the people who hold them. In collaboration and not in some kind of appropriation.
Thank you. Let's move from environmental rights to, from human rights to animal rights. In the chapter 5 of dogs, horses, and buffaloes in Cameroon, companion animals in Cameroon fiction, the chapter is very descriptive. And the objective of your thesis was to indicate how literary texts can be seen as achieving environmental activism. But in that chapter, you summarize very well the interactions of animals and human, and animals between themselves as well. But I don't really see how those could be used to improve or promote activism, notably animal rights. First, I haven't really seen how you elaborate on the concept of animality. What does that imply in terms of social or legal status in the Congo Basin? Is an animal in the Congo Basin just like an animal anywhere else, or is the definition different? And if I may go through the novels that you've used in that chapters, in Patrice Ngana's novel Temps de Chien, the narrator is a dog with a human name, Bunjab. And that dog considers that humans have become animals in the hands of the dictator because the dictator can kill them with impunity. And the same dog says that the humans have resumed their humanity when they stand up for their rights in a social protest. In Gaston Paul Effa's text, Cheval Roi, horses display some human-like attitudes. And when an old and sick horse is to be euthanized, instead of the term abattoir, slaughterhouse, which refers to the space where killing animals is acceptable or normal, the narrator uses the expression couloir de la mort, which refers to the prison cells for humans who have received a death sentence. I can also mention Etienne Guermide's novel, Le silence de la forêt, that is studied in chapter 7. And in that book, the Babingas, a community of people living in the forest, are described as animals because of their cultural difference. And also in Beaufin's novel, Congo Inc., the death of a tiger is mourned by the local patriarch as if that tiger was a member of the family. So it is clear that the line between humans and animals is very thin. Animality and humanity are being construed as a continuum. So how can you interpret that to show how the novel you study advocate for animal rights? Is there any connection between the protection of animals and the fight for human rights if the line is so thin between the two?
Thank you. This provides a good transition to talk about these related rights, human rights and animal rights. And I think the first point for me is to briefly mention something about human rights in the sense of environmental justice, because within environmental studies, environmental scholarship, especially environmental literary studies, and also other forms of post-colonial studies that relate to the environment, not necessarily from the literary perspective, but the broader environmental humanities, this notion of environmental justice or injustice is quite prominent or appears time and again. And I agree that in efforts to protect nature, in efforts to mitigate climate change, there are usually violations of human rights and different forms of human rights. For example, those highlighted in the chapter on pollution, such as the right to clean water and sanitation, for example, and then also even rights to their spirituality and the rights to live where they want and to live the kinds of modes of life that please them. And now to come to the question of animal rights, the first thing I would like to acknowledge that yes, in that chapter, the chapter that discusses the buffaloes, dogs, and horses, I do not explicitly use the word animal rights, because the chapter is much more framed from the perspective of companionship, the companionship or even a kinship between humans and animals. And these animals are the horse, the dog, and the buffalo. And I agree with scholars like Angaben and Heise and others who, for example, theorize that humans only tend to be humans, or are actually only humans because they try to oppose themselves to other animals. And this really poses a question about animality, because how often do we acknowledge our own animality? How often do humans acknowledge that we are actually also animals? And so by doing so, by defining ourselves mostly in terms of positioning ourselves as being different from other animals, it gives birth to a lot of problematics, including the use of metaphors like the one that you just highlighted in Le silence de la forêt, because we have come to think that, well, if you want to insult a person, you might say, you look like this, you look like a monkey, or you are an animal, as the people call the Babingas animals. And it's actually a kind of an ignorance of them, not knowing that they, or who are calling people that way, are also animals. And so these kinds of metaphors, I think that literature and the arts, more generally speaking, can help us to identify these kinds of problematic metaphors and be able to either reformulate them or reinvent completely new kinds of metaphors that describe our relationships as humans with, or as human animals with more than human animals. And then you also asked about animality in terms of the social and the legal, and if an animal in the Congo Basin has the same rights as an animal elsewhere, I think that there are some fundamental differences, even in terms of legislation. To go by legislation, if we take the Ecuadorian Constitution of 2008, for example, which enshrines this concept of the rights of nature therein, so far, no matter how, for example, Gabon and Congo Brazzaville are, all the efforts they are deploying in their environmental concerns, I think none of these countries have gone as far as promulgating laws that respect the rights of nature per se, perhaps more implicitly in different aspects of the legal text that exist there. So, and this automatically means that perhaps an animal in Ecuador, for example, will have already more rights than an animal in the Congo Basin, perhaps, and it's a matter of legality, and the legality comes from humans. But of course, all those animals have the same rights as we, the human animals. And then the use of couloir de la mort instead of the abattoir. Yes, I think that this is a beautiful way for Gaston Paul-Effin to bring to the fore the rights of animals and the fact that they have to be protected, because within eco-critical scholarship, there is this need or this call for both animals and humans to be respected. And this is even beginning to happen within critical plant studies, where scholars argue that we should be aware that all animals, including us, are sentient, feel pain, and therefore should not be subjected to unnecessary pain. And so it is a good way to describe that abattoir by calling it a couloir de la mort, because it really evokes emotions that can lead us to more reflections and perhaps to think about protecting the rights of those animals. And so to round off on this point, I think that although I've not actually mentioned animal rights explicitly in the chapter about animals, because it is mostly framed from the perspective of companionship, the chapter on water pollution and urbanization gives me the possibility to talk about the rights of nature. And I am convinced that within the rights of nature are also the rights of animals, the rights of plants, the rights of rocks, and the rights of the whole earth.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. So I'll end up still with the animal, but this time about the novel, The Buffalo Hunter by Athanasius Salais. In the novel, the hunter kills the buffalo, even though he had developed a very strong bond with it. At the same time, he shows a lot of love for his dog. I was wondering, is this a form of speciesism? The hunter, who seems reluctant to kill the buffalo, finally gives in order not to lose faith in the community. Is this an indication that animal rights is culturally informed? Would you say, from your knowledge, not just of the novel that you've studied in your thesis, but literature and culture in the Congo Basin, that indigenous culture there is compatible or incompatible with the defense of animal rights? Are all animals equal?
Absolutely not. All animals are not equal, and this points us in the direction of looking at the valuable aspects of our indigenous cultures. Because permit me here to use an example, because you've asked me to think about this beyond even the novel, and I would like to use my local community of Nsah, where I come from, in the Anglophone part of Cameroon. We have what we call sacred animals. We have some animals that we are prohibited from killing, for example. And because we believe that if you kill them, you will have some consequences on you. For example, the scorpion. If you touch or see a scorpion, you have to catch it, and you have to be sealed lips. It's sealed your lips until you go to a traditional doctor for some cleansing. And I think that, yes, and this automatically makes the scorpion a very special animal. And so I agree with you that it's a form of speciesism and also a form of like hierarchies, establishing hierarchies within animals. And there are things that are important to be revisited in some sense, of course. But again, this is a very sleepy terrain, because it will also be very difficult to just walk up and go and tell the better people that you have to include the fowl in among the sacred animals of this community. So, so from this, I think that, yeah, we need to carry on with more reflections on this and see how we can use the authorities and the traditional institutions that have been able to classify these animals or to identify them and put them in these boxes to see if they can, for example, help us with environmental protection and management of animals. And this, again, we can have examples in places like Oku, Mbesa, and Com, where the community forestry management has even finally been left in the hands of local authorities known as the Quifa, which is like a traditional or indigenous National Assembly. So I think that can be helpful in a way. But then, and we also, to come back to this question where you raised that Mbunjak, the dog in Patrice Ngana's novel, has a human name, Mbunjak, and looks at humans as having lost their values in the face of the dictatorship described in this novel. And this reminds me of the concept proposed by a Cameroonian literary scholar, Jacques Famindongo, who talks about Cosmo Criticism. And in explaining this, for example, there is this, because within African indigenous cosmologies, most, I cannot pretend to speak for an entire continent here, but the point is that within most of these cosmologies, there is absolutely no distinction between humans and other animals and even other beings. And that is why even you will find a river that is believed to have a soul, to be a being in its entirety, a rock that is believed to be have a soul in its entirety. And so within this Cosmo Criticism that he proposes, he thinks that for us, instead of talking of eco-criticism, we could instead talk about Cosmo Criticism, so that we look at the whole cosmology of any specific group or setting and text in question. And then he uses the example of names. We have names, for example, like Nsah and other names within the Bantu communities, especially among the Bulus and Cameroon, which are actually names of animals. Like I think Nsah means panther, and then there is a name that means elephant. It's actually given to humans. So you see, there is this give and take amongst the community of human animals and other kinds of animals, so that you will find Mbunjak bearing what we will consider a human name, and then we will also have humans bearing names borrowed from animals. And that is actually a way of celebrating this kind of collaboration and harmony and cohabitation between the different animals, including us.
Thank you very much, Ken, for thoroughly answering my questions, and I congratulate you on dissertation well written and questions well answered. Thank you, Karen Margaret. I think I've done with my questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Etienne Marie, for your questions and dialogue. And now we have 20 minutes for questions from the ex-auditorium. The time includes the answer from Kenneth. And the first who would like to ask a question is Associate Professor Peter Bakker, who's from Linguistics at Aarhus University. And I'd like to ask you to come up here. And Kirsten, is it possible for you to pin this computer? Because then the online audience will be able to see Peter Bakker more clearly. Right, so if you stand here, Peter.
Yes.
Right, okay. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, Kenneth. It was a pleasure to listen to your talk and also the discussion. And of course, I'm a linguist. And those people here who read the university newspaper also know that I never read literature, maybe one novel a year. And that's not what I'm going to ask you about. But I want to mention that one of the very first novels I read was a novel written in 1885 in Dutch, and maybe it's translated also, which is in fact an ecological novel, and I think it influenced my life. So this answers also it says something about the question that Scott asked, and also he mentioned this. What I'm going to ask you, if you are of course from a country which is one of the richest in the world as far as languages are concerned, with more than 200 languages. And I wondered, as linguists, we deplore the fact that more and more languages disappear. And that's also an ecological disaster for humanity. Yeah. And as far as I understand, I haven't read your dissertation, you use English books and plays written in English and in French, which is already fine, of course, but what about literature in indigenous languages? Would it contribute to the ecological situation of the world if more languages are used in literature, and also for the preservation of the diversity, or linguistic diversity of our planet?
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much, Peter, for this wonderful question. And yes, as Scott did mention, although English and French are like the predominant languages of my dissertation, I also engage with local languages. For example, occasionally I cite instances from my local best language, and also, of course, other languages, including Pidgin English, which I know you are quite aware of. And that is a language that I honestly believe, because one of the things about, which you've already said it, about this kind of literature that has as objective or intends to spread ecological messages, is that it should be accessible to the audiences. And of course, we are talking here about a country, for example, like Cameroon, with almost 300 languages. And sometimes there are many Cameroonians who don't speak French or English, and it will still be important for them to be able to understand this language. So I absolutely agree with you that it is important to also write in these languages. Although I've not actually analyzed a full poem or a full play here written in a local language, but I will not hesitate to do so if I find one. And I also salute the efforts of one of our literary giants on the continent, who is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, because he has written enormously in his Gikuyu language. And I think that that is something to consider. And just in passing, I am also a writer. And sometimes I write in the Nsah language, but it's just that it was not about me in this dissertation. So I think that, yeah, that is a way of serving both languages and serving ecology. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter Barke. And the next person who would like to ask a question is a young Dirai, who is a scholar of economics and IT at University of Southern Denmark. So please come up here.
Well, good day, Mr. Kenneth. It's a pleasure to listen to you, and it's really scholarly. Like you can see, I'm like I study and like to study anyways. So education is like atmosphere, has no boundary. I'm really satisfied and glad to it. Everything you have said here is really touched me, because I'm also from that ecological area, was the equator, the Congo Basin in particular. So we know from the topic, it said environmental literary activism. And as a matter of fact, we know literature is a work of art and put it in play. How can we harmonize literature as a work of art in context of searching a solution, scientific solution to the contemporary problems that we are facing today, that is fauna and flora and humans in particular? And then the question is interrelated. Today, there's so much talk of the youth. There's no future with regards to climate change. Like they're from Greta,
yeah.
The rulers of today, they are, let's say, older than us, those who are ruling, and the new generation, some unborn yet. How can we put them to get the solution? Is it from top down or from down up or interrelated? Because like a young generation can be searching for management, control, sustainable management of the environment, from my own point of view, while those at the top will be coming from damage control. So which of them are we going to use to really get to the solution? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayo. Yes, your first question is about literature and activism. And I think that the whole essence of this dissertation is about that. So that I'm arguing, and of course, I'm not the first person to do this kind of argument, but I think I'm the first about the Congo Basin, but there are other, because eco-criticism is actually that theory, and I also call it sometimes a movement that asks us to act on the ecological crisis by not only reading books, but let us read books in ways that could potentially save even a frog. Because as one scholar has remarked, what use it is if we create all concepts, notions, and theories in university halls like this one about frogs, about cats, about dogs, and that in the end of the day, the dogs are disappearing, the cats are disappearing. So there must be a way of connecting, and there must be a way of going beyond the silos, beyond the small tongues, the closed doors of the academy into real world issues. And I think literature has a potential contribution in that direction alongside other efforts. And then your question about young people and tomorrow, and whether we should approach it from the top or from the bottom. I think a top-bottom approach will just maybe be more problematic. I think it's more consensual and sitting on the table and listening to everyone, including especially the young people. Because as we know, as Nixon describes, and we all know, the young people are the ones who are going to inherit the most consequences of the crisis today. So we need to, as much as possible, create room to hear the voices in addition to any other voice that is on the table. And in ways that are not very hierarchical, because if they are very hierarchical, like top down there, it comes back to the kinds of situations that we see in a play like Le Cri de la Forêt, where a young boy who is saying things that can be helpful about keeping the forest is driven out of a meeting just because he is a child.
Thank you to Eva Young Pillai. Thank you very much. And I hope I haven't overlooked somebody who wanted to ask a question. I don't think I have. So we will now move on to the last part of the defense, and I'll invite Marianne Pinghwang up here. So please. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this, Kenneth, really. Yeah, you already kind of, you get that we have been impressed and really have enjoyed working and discussing on the basis of your dissertation. And at the end of my role today, I'll summarize a bit of the committee's findings and the assessment, and also the discussion today. But before that, I have the privilege and pleasure of asking you a few questions or dialoguing a bit with you. And I think it actually connects very much to your questions. Because I think I want to approach the literary environmental activism from the point of view of imagination, and which actually plays a role in your dissertation. It plays a, yeah, I'll try. Yeah, thank you. Because when conceptualizing literature as useful or functional, you often attract the criticism for simplifying the intricate and inner function of literature as artwork. Your approach, I think, actually opens up to artistic capacities harbored in literature and its performative features. and that is a capacity for creating a social and environmental imagination. And that is what I would like to talk to you about, and ask you about. In rather early in your dissertation, you speaks about literature's contribution to saving the Congo Basin. And you say, literature's capacity to deal with complexity, to spotlight various forms of injustice, to raise ecological awareness, to educate various audiences, readers, and to influence behavioral transformation that align with sustainability, both at the political and individual everyday levels. So literature is kind of doing a sort of world making in this complex and interdisciplinary field, which you also open up this field of hybridity. So we've been talking a bit about sort of the way that literary environmental activism might be considered science communication. And I would like to move the other way around a bit. Because I think the way you highlight the aesthetics of urgency as driving for a certain educational and didactic form or forms for awareness raising through literature, through art. This is only possible if art, if literature actually harbors the capacity for imagination, for creating, for raising not only awareness and agency, but a social imagination. And a social imagination which goes beyond individual or even individualistic artistic imagination. And this leads me into chapter 4, which is my favorite chapter, actually, on our children. It's the title is "Our Children Will Fight for the Climate: How Congo Basin Writers Prophesized Global Youth Activism." In this chapter, you analyze how youth activism is fictionalized in a way, or put into plays, and I'll focus on the plays. You treat or analyze plays, one novel, the novel by Rodrigo, and one poem. And this analysis you also counter in a way, but also connects to an explanation of something we already discussed, like the timid youth climate movement in Africa, also beyond the Congo Basin. And you propose then also that the authors of the Congo Basin prophesized the crucial role of children and youth in climate activism before the rising of the youth climate movement in the global north. Yeah. So the rights of youth in environmental issues has been kind of stated already with the UN agenda, which you also quote, and has been recently ruled by a federal German court, stating that youth have a right by law to be included in decision-making on climate change and environmental issues. So this court ruling actually points to the legal obligation of local and national authorities to include youth. Yet the youth climate movement, such as Friday for Futures and school strikes for climate, and the involvement also of youth in what you might call experimental governance, are also, and you point to that very strongly, positions of privilege. It's what you reference as the full stomach environmentalism of the North. Yeah. And you explain sort of why are these movements timid, still timid in the global South, in Africa, beyond Congo Basin also. And I would like maybe to ask you, not about, we already discussed sort of the way political regimes are kind of inhibiting, to say the least, activism when taken to the streets. But I would like to ask you about sort of, you also point to colonial legacies and cultural resistance towards regarding or acknowledging youth as a singular driving force for environmental activism.
Yeah.
Could you maybe expand a bit on like the cultural resistance, the resistance in the communities, in society at large, maybe towards maybe even giving youth a voice?
Yeah, thank you. This question, I like it because I want to use it to talk about this thing of children, both in the text as it happens in the text, but also in reality, because I've tried to explain it in the dissertation, but I didn't go quite far, for example, in using the real life experiences. But as the Le Cri de la Forêt, for example, mentions, depicts, we find that a child supposedly by the uncle is not supposed to be in the meeting of children.
Exactly.
Yes, and that is symptomatic actually of a very prevalent culture in many places around the Congo Basin, including where I come from, where, for example, generally children are not allowed to participate in conversations of adults. And I think that that is already a form of cultural resistance. And sometimes it's even patriarchal when, for example, children and women are both sidelined from bringing their own voice to the table and making contributions to this kind of things. And I think that absolutely these are things that have to be revisited in one way or the other. Because if you, to add to the concept that you just quoted, that the full stomach environmentalism of the North versus maybe the empty stomach environmentalism of the South, which is a beautiful but also a troubling contrast because normally children in the South should not be empty stomach, of course, and it's not every children, sometimes some children, but we also have a lot of children in the global South who eat to their full satisfaction and also throw some food and waste food. But then it's also already hints or links up to this whole idea of resource curse, or why should it be the Congo Basin where a child, for whatever reason, should go to bed hungry? That's unimaginable. That should normally not happen. And it then gets into these implications of global capital. Where does the food move? In which direction does the food move? In which direction does the petrol move? And all of those kind of things. And then, okay. Then you also, and you ask how this guy, I think it is actually quite a big impediment. Yeah, it's a big impediment from the cultural perspective, and it's and this resistance, if compared now, if we check the children up north, for example, here, children in Denmark, as I've lived here for the past 3 years, I've seen that children are quite often like allowed to discuss with the adults, in ways that are more, so and they're almost like no taboo. I think that's because in this spirit of hybridity, there is always one or two things that we can learn from one culture and extrapolate into another. And I think that more and more there will be need for those innocent voices, as described in Le Cri de la Forêt, to be listened to, because they can be very insightful at times, and even most of the time.
Good, because this leads me then, I think, into something we already touched on. Scott touched upon it, and that is the place that you are analyzing. And you, I fully understand that it's because you don't have any documentation of these plays being staged, and neither of the reviews or the impact. But I'm still going to ask you about it. Sorry.
It's okay.
Because you also points to the plays which are driven by an aesthetic of urgency, are in the tradition of the theater for development, and community theater, right? And owes something also to the audience involvement and to the co-creation paradigm of the theater of the oppressed and Auguste Duval's forum theater. So, although you don't have documentation of the stagings, could you maybe expand a bit about, because you point to these plays and the way the playwrights actually actualize their activism by staging the plays, by putting, and I quote, their literary ideologies into physical action through organization of public, school-based, and community performances of their environmental plays. So this tradition, is this tradition still alive as a kind of community engaging tradition of public theater that is staged beyond sort of the theater institution? Is it still alive? Is it still working, or has it turned into a kind of campaign theater, maybe? which is also said about the theater for development, right? That it kind of became sometimes a broadcaster for NGOs. But is it still alive? Is it still, do you still have this kind of school-based or community-based activist plays?
Yeah, I think that we still have them, but not in the same way that we had, for example, in the early 90s. Yeah, if we put aside the environmental theater, or theater that is mostly concerned with environmental issues today, because as far as I know, Jose Collins Ekwanye runs a theater troupe in Brazzaville in the Congo, which is an environmental theater troupe. And so far, that's the only environmental theater troupe that I know around the Congo Basin. But I know quite a good number of other theater troupes which are not explicitly focused on environmental problems. And I'm even in touch with some of them for some other research at the moment, and which is in the direction of sustainability. And I'm hoping to be able to glean things out of there that can be useful. But for the moment, I think a lot of attention has gone to other things. And I think, I guess that one factor for this is that because in the early days of theater for development in Cameroon, in the days of people like Bole Botake, in the days of people like Gilbert Doho and the rest, there was a lot of funding. And we have this institutional problem, both because there is no funding. And so I think that in a very significant extent contributes to lack of this. And it's really regrettable that there are no theater troupes that I know so far that are very much engaged into this. But I hope that the research I'm in contact with those people for could stimulate something in that direction.
Because it has this, it actually leads into the question about reading play texts, because in the theater for development, I think agency is thought to be raised, agency and awareness is thought to be raised when acting through a persona. So you would have a community, and you will have the community actors, right? And say the young girl will act the young girl, and will address the community, amongst which might be her father, on, say, issues of agency, issues of education, whatever, issues of inequality. So here the aesthetics of urgency drives a very direct and situated outcome, a dialogue, a provocation even, but also a provocation that kind of plays out in the community as such. How would you say, can this be channeled in the play as a written or printed and read text?
Yeah, and this reminds me about an observation in the preliminary report that points in this direction of the plays or acts, or wonders if the plays could also be considered as being co-creations with the youth. And I think that's a fascinating way of looking at it, because, and again, and it's within this tradition that I've already discussed at the introduction of the work. I mean, the tradition of theater for development that trickles down to whether it's popular theater or political theater. Yeah, and I think, yes, there is a sense in which, especially someone like Ekpe Inyang, who has been very directly connected to theater for development, has collaborated with people like other theater practitioners like Bate Bisong in Cameroon. I think that he acknowledges this, and I want to assume that for all of these playwrights, there is some kind of inherent belief that the plays are not finished works, such that we don't only have the performance of the plays, but we have even the performance of the creation of the plays. Yeah. So I think that there is performativity at least two levels: performing the play and then performing the creation of the play. As in when, for example, those kids that you mentioned here, a child acting a child, because imagine that the play known as Le Bénévole. Yeah, where young children are acting the police, acting the custom officer, and acting and then arresting people who have committed ecological crimes. And by the time that children are trained to stage that play, I think in one way or the other, the message has already been transmitted to the child in question. And so that play at that time of being staged is already a participatory co-creation, co-performance between the author and the children. And I think it can actually be quite helpful in terms of stimulating or activating or inspiring activism.
Empowering.
Empowering. To use your term. Thank you.
Because I was thinking, in comparison to then the youth climate movement of the North, that is actually also a kind of big co-created spectacle theater, right? But it actually empowers to be on that stage as well.
Exactly.
And then I would ask you one more question about sort of youth in theater. You bridge in a way from writing about youth as personas in these various plays to propose the child and the youth as metaphors for hope. And I was wondering what the outcome for activism, literary activism, is of this more universalizing approach. So the child and the young person as metaphors or symbols for hope, as opposed to a child or a young person who is very directly and situated being empowered by art or by knowledge or whatever.
I think yes, there is that risk of universalism, and also and this reminds me of even the whole idea of who is the face of the youth climate movement globally, because for most people it's Greta Thunberg, but that actually obliviates, that actually hides a lot of other young children behind the scenes. And this is the moment for me to mention, for example, Vanessa Nakate from Uganda. Because I think all of them, these voices need to be recognized, and also and there is a sense in which some critics of, for example, Greta Thunberg think that children are being instrumentalized. There is that sense, but also it can be possible, but at the same time, we must do something about the future, and the future is for the children. And I also agree that, and especially within the tradition of post-colonial eco-criticism, that each time there is some planetary thinking, each time there is some global thinking, we should also be look out for the caveats, especially in terms of universalization, and pick out some specificities. And I think that's something to keep in mind. I'll
Yeah,
keep that in mind.
It always enhances learning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I will keep that in mind as I talk about or discuss the child as a symbol or a
Yeah.
metaphor for hope.
I think one of the most, and now I'm sort of moving into my last two questions before summarizing and praising you and whatever. I think one of the most original and striking and intriguing lines of argument in your dissertation, maybe even, is found in chapter 4, and has to do with the notion of literary prophecy. The selected authors of this chapter, you say, are heralding youth as fundamental for working towards desired future states. So they're kind of foretelling, in a way, in order to take up action on climate change. You argue that youth climate activism has been foretold in this way by these literary prophecies, and that this prophecy also speaks from science through the background informed capacity of the authors, many of whom you already spoke about, that holds professional scientific positions. So I'm curious as to how you came to the concept of literary prophecy. And we discussed it a bit in the committee. Why not prediction or even modeling? Or yeah, I could find an answer to that, but how you see literary prophecy as also, in a way, heralding literature and the capacity literature has of imagining a future while still be grounded, say, in facts and science and whatever. Yeah, but how did you come about speaking about literary prophecy?
Part of the inspiration is, I think, religious in the sense of the biblical prophets.
Yes.
Yeah, but also more in the sense of writers as this not only ordinary beings, but beings with a special intuition that enables them to see deep into the future, or maybe to go far into the past. So that's one way of having arrived at that, or one of the points of inspiration that I got for doing that. And yes, I also look at it as these prophecies from the perspective, as we already mentioned, of these authors being aware of some of the scientific documents that we've cited, like the UN documents that I've talked about, highlighted the role of children in the climate and ecological debates, and using those ones. And so, but then generally, yeah, I think that this is not even just limited to the text that I've analyzed here, because in a sense, we can also apply this whole concept of literary prophets beyond the Congo Basin writers to the category of writers writing within the genre of climate fiction. Yeah. And except that some of the scenarios that they imagine, we are still waiting to see how they will unfold.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. I wanted actually to ask you something very particular then in this line of literary prophecy. Prophecy laments present states, right?
Can you come again, please? Can you come again?
Yeah. I'm going to ask you something very particular on a reference, actually.
Okay.
Because prophecy laments present states, right?
Yeah.
Laments present states and heralds future hope in a call for action. So there is a lot of this social imagination in this kind of literary prophecy. And it's also a very particular form of future-oriented storytelling, which made me think about, and I think maybe also the works referenced in your bibliography for this chapter. There's one work on Toni Morrison as a prophetic writer. Whether the work of prophetic imagination by Walter Brueggemann has played any role
So he was an Old Testament scholar
Okay.
in the US, and also an activist poet,
Okay.
and influenced the US civil rights movement very, very much.
Okay.
And he says in a particular place in this this book on prophetic imagination, that prophetic texts could be seen as poetic scenarios of alternative social reality that might lead to direct confrontation with presumed taking for granted worlds. I think in a way, so he also comes from like theology and divinity and things like that, but he actually comes into poetry and activism. But you didn't.
I wasn't aware of it.
No.
Thank you for mentioning it. I think that's what I should read.
Yeah, maybe so. I think before moving into summarizing, I think this would be a nice place for me to sort of step down from the questioning and the discussion, because it's a nice place to end the conversation. It's a note of hope for activism driven by imagination and story making also, which might help us fortify ourselves to stay with the trouble rather than reverting to Edenic pasts or relying too much on grand future solutions. And that has also been a contribution from your dissertation to me. So thank you for that. So I'm now to summarize our assessment, our findings in the committee. You already got that we are quite impressed, right? So the committee found your dissertation strikingly original in its approach, not least in the way the African post-colonial eco-criticism is decompartmentalized in various ways. And we also spoke about that, discussed that. You transgress language divides, you cross genre barriers in literature, and you go beyond national borders. You built your research on state-of-the-art eco-critical frameworks. So you're very up to date, you're very informed. And you also impressively go beyond the state of the art by introducing your own original phrases and concepts, which are actually the ones we've been discussing today, I think. Background informed literary activism, simultaneous violence, and also the various African concepts such as eco-Ubuntu and aesthetics of urgency. You're also a clear and graceful writer, and you demonstrate an impressive awareness of Congo Basin literature and of African literature more broadly. So this is a gift to literary studies. Right? So the objectives of your dissertation are clearly stated, and the analysis well focused on demonstrating how literature can become environmental activism. You master a vast horizon of cultural and literary theories and aptly blend concepts from Anglo-Saxon eco-criticism, Francophone eco-critique, French engagement littéraire, post-colonial studies, and African indigenous epistemologies, all to discuss and demonstrate literature's ability to impact social change and mitigate climate change and ecological degradation, and thus to answer your core research question, can literature save the Congo Basin? And I think our discussion today, our dialogue, has centered on the way you open this hybrid and complex field, and also in your conceptualization go beyond the state of the art, sort of put forward new concepts. So we have been discussing background informed literary activism, connected to or in conflict maybe with the professional position of the author. We have also been discussing how indigenous knowledge systems may be integrated with non-African epistemologies underlying exactly the background informed activism. How your original concept of simultaneous violence also opens up to a discussion on violence to nature, violence or violence in various intersectional forms in human society. What is cause? What is effect? How can this be mitigated actually? We have discussed how awareness of human-animal entanglement and companion animals bring animal rights to the fore, and how that balances with human rights in a way, and the rights of nature. And we have discussed, obviously, literary activism, how it acts in real life activism and also through art. I think it has been a rather wonderful dialogue, and I think that I have gained even more insights. I think that also goes for the audience. It has been a pleasure. So before withdrawing, and we are going to now vote you outside, I actually want to quote our overall assessment in the preliminary report. We say that you have contributed an original and impressive dissertation, carefully researched and well presented. The overarching goal of the project is to work with novelists, playwrights, and poets from 5 Congo Basin countries to demonstrate how literature can impact on climate and environmental crisis in the Congo Basin, and powerfully illuminate a wide range of misconceptions about Africa that supports neo-colonialism and neoliberalism and undermine African cultural traditions and knowledge systems. Most readers of this dissertation and the articles that appear in it will not be very familiar with the primary text, and you gracefully provide detailed summaries of the works as well as specific interpretations and contextualizations of the work in literary history and in theoretical frameworks. This deservingly opens up your research and also the literature of the Congo Basin to international scholarship. Your dissertation is ambitious, one that few scholars would be capable of undertaking, and certainly not with the breadth and depth and clarity that you demonstrate. So now we'll go and vote and see how that goes.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And this was the conclusion of the defense. But as Marianne has already hinted, we're not quite finished. Marianne will now leave the room, and she will take Scott Slovich and Etienne Marie with her in a breakout room, and they'll be joined with by the main supervisor. And while they are out, we will wait for them. I want to invite you to stay in the room. And also I want to invite the online audience to stay with us so that you can hear the results. They will come back and tell us if they can recommend that the Faculty of Arts give the PhD title to Kenneth. On the grounds of this defense. So we'll wait, and while we're waiting, I can just say welcome to the co-supervisor who will join us in the break. I forgot to welcome you. This is Peter Mortensen, the co-supervisor. Welcome as well. He's been teaching. So yeah, so we'll wait with excitement, and we hope it will not take too long.
Exactly.
Mhm.
What are we hearing? I hope you're not hearing the rotate. Do you want a phone? Yeah, so it would be nice to. Yes, he wasn't around that. Yeah, I think they, yeah. And it recorded everything. So people will be able to see it. Marianne, you want to go on here? I do. And we're just waiting for them to come back from the breakout room. Can you ping Scott and Tim? Just a second. And can you perhaps also open the cameras from the audience? but yeah, it is difficult. We can see them.
And this is called Dissertation.
I don't know what's the... Okay,
Oh,
there,
yeah.
they are.
Here we are.
Okay, and afterwards, it's nice if we can see the whole online audience as well. So you keep that.
Yeah.
Okay, Marianne.
Yeah, so we deliberated, no? And talked and voted, and we are unanimously congratulating you that we'll recommend the graduate school, Faculty of Arts, Aarhus University, to bestow the PhD title for you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Graduate School of Arts, I would like to thank the assessment committee for their huge work. I would like to thank the audience for staying with us. And especially I would like to thank you, Kenneth, for writing the thesis and for also entering in and giving us such an interesting afternoon. It's been a great pleasure to witness the defense. So thank you very much. And also, on behalf of the School of Communication and Culture and on behalf of Kenneth, I'd like to invite you all. That's only the physical audience for a reception. You are all very warmly invited to participate in the reception. It will take place on the 4th floor in the kitchen, and you can just follow us when we go. So I hope to see you up there for just to have a glass and celebrate. So, but thank you very much to all of you. You want to come in the photo? Right. Sorry, I hope I'm not. Can you join? You want me to join?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then after you shall not answer.
Jacqueline. Okay. Yeah.